Welcome to Authentic Living with Roxanne, a place where we have conscious conversations about things that really matter in our lives. And now here's your host, Roxanne Derhodge.
Hi everyone, it's Roxanne Derhodge. Welcome to Authentic Living and with Roxanne. This week I have a colleague, Jason Finucan, that is based in Montreal that will speak to us today. Jason, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So Jason he speaks on mental health, and I'm going to just read a little bit of his bio on some of the things that he's done. Upcoming really soon, he's releasing his first book, which is Jason 1, Stigma 0, My Battle with Mental Illness at Work and at home and in the workplace. He's a mental health advocate, stigma fighter. He's a professional speaker and has been doing that for quite a while, I believe since 2006, I remember reading, and founder of Stigma 0 and the instructor of the programs found in there's a Stigma 0 online training program. Jason's faced both physical and mental illness and shares his personal experiences and the impactful storytelling techniques blended with research to mobilize knowledge and perspective. His goal is to bring everyone to understand the importance of the topic so they're empowered to make a change and ultimately join his vision for future without stigma. That would be so nice as someone that's worked in the field, Jason. And I think we're coming along, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So, so thanks for taking the time today. And I'm going to just jump right into it and ask you, obviously, I'm going to assume we know how you got into speaking about mental health, but tell me a little bit about your life. Did you grow up in Montreal?
No, I am an Ontario boy, actually.
Oh.
I am. I was born in Newmarket, and I lived, I was born in 75. In the first 26 years of my life, I lived within 100 kilometers of Toronto.
Wow.
I was in Newmarket and then in Toronto briefly. And then I went to high school in Orillia, Ontario,
Right.
An hour and a half north of Toronto. And I went to University of Waterloo. And so the seeds of me being a public speaker as a profession were honestly set early. It was one of the skills that I just, at an early age, I remember giving I think I read a poem at a Christmas special or something at my school. I was in grade 4. My dad was blown away that his son, because my dad hates public speaking, and here his son was up on the stage in front of hundreds of people, comfortable. And so it was just one of those things. I never was uncomfortable in front of a crowd. And then when I said I went to University of Waterloo, I actually took a degree in theater and speech communication. So I spent 4 years doing nothing but performing and learning how to perform and learning how performance is interpreted. And that helped me immensely. I didn't know at the time I was going to be a speaker, but I knew I liked it. And it definitely helped me to hone those skills. But I moved to Montreal in 2001, actually. It's easy to remember for a sad reason. I moved just days before 9/11. I moved that weekend, that Labor Day weekend.
Yes.
And I've been here ever since. I absolutely love it here.
Well, it's amazing your undergrad was kind of prepping you for something that and now you've been speaking for such a long time. So tell me about the kind of the path, like when you start to struggle. Did you kind of know when you were younger that there was some issues? I mean, I was just actually talking to my son, and I was telling him that I was about to interview you, and we talked a little bit. He said, "Well, what?" He said, "Well, what does he struggle with?" So I told him from what I read on your site that it's bipolar that was the struggle. And he goes, "Well, what is that, Mom?" And I said, "Well, the only way I could explain to him and in teenage terms is that there's a lot of high highs and low lows, and the space in between is quite rapid." And he goes, "Oh, interesting." And he says, "Oh, that seems, don't we all go through highs and lows. I said, yes, but sometimes not at such a progressive level. So I don't know if I, explain that as well as you might be able to do it, day to day. I'm sure you speak to a lot of different people about it.
You're definitely part of the way to describe it is the severity of the change, but it's also the severity of the actual high and the actual low. So an individual who goes through a healthy high or a healthy low, the way I describe that as humans, you're absolutely right. We're not just going to exist on one plane. We're always going to go above and below what I would describe as our baseline, our, whatever is our normal, for energy levels, amount of sleep, etc. But the thing with bipolar disorder is that when the highs come, they come very forcefully. You have no control over it. And in my case, they lasted for weeks and months at a time. So I would be in this elevated state for a very long time with no ability to stop it. And then when I was in a depressed state, whether it was mild, moderate, or severe, that depressed state would descend on me and I would have no control over it. And it would remain, again, for sometimes months at a time. That's not something that you would describe as a normal or healthy experience of highs and lows. And for me, when it started, I actually was a very late onset of bipolar disorder. It's very common for it to begin in the late teens, early 20s. That would be the more standard time frame. But for me, I had absolutely no symptoms until my mid-20s and no significant symptoms till I was 26. Wow. So that was very odd that it took that long to begin. So when it began with a mild depression, and I had never experienced any form of clinical depression in my life up to that point. Not for 1 minute. I mean, every time I'd ever felt down or sad or low energy, there was a really good, clear reason for it. But now, here I was in Montreal. My career was going well. My personal life was great. I had a wonderful girlfriend who I was planning to, propose to, and I had a job I loved working for McGill University. And suddenly I felt awful, and it lasted for 2 months. And that was in 2002. And that was a year after I got to Montreal. And that began a cycle of, I would go down into a depressive episode for a couple months. And I would go right past my baseline overnight into a hypomanic, which is like mild mania episode. And that would last for a few months. And I just went back and forth for 2.5 years before I was finally diagnosed and treated.
So at what point, did you start to realize, I'm going to assume at first you thought, God, this feel internally, something's changing.
Mm-hmm.
At what point did you start to write? Did you recognize it? Did your girlfriend recognize it? Did people at work start to react to you differently? What started to happen that, made you realize something's awry here?
My girlfriend noticed it immediately, and she was the most on top of it. And also she was the least affected by stigma. To her, it was just, there's something wrong here. Like, I think you might have a mental illness or you might have depression. She started doing research. I had an enormous amount of stigma towards mental illness without knowing it. And so when it happened to me, there was this long period of denial in my own mind of just, I can't have a mental illness, because I was associating mental illness with a character weakness or someone who wasn't trying hard enough, or wasn't, willing to do the work. And I knew I was willing to do the work. So I went through this, self-stigma is a real problem that I'm now currently trying to solve in others. And that problem basically is when you take all this stigma about mental illness and you apply it directly towards yourself, and it causes a massive delay in diagnosis and treatment. Mm-hmm. So as much as I knew something was wrong, I wasn't willing to even entertain the idea that what was wrong was a mental illness. So right. There was a period there about a year into symptoms that I sought out talk therapy with a psychologist, mm-hmm. which can be a brilliant strategy for a lot of people in that situation. But for me, it wasn't a strategy. It was procrastination. I literally chose talk therapy to avoid the idea that I would be diagnosed and have to take medication. And I was fortunate that the therapist was brilliant and was very astute. And after several sessions listening to me, go over the things I'd gone through in my life to see maybe was this connected to some past trauma. And she was the one who said to me, look, you don't need me. What you have is almost certainly bipolar disorder. She said, I can't diagnose you because I'm a psychologist, not a psychiatrist, but my professional opinion is you need to see a psychiatrist. You probably are going to be diagnosed as bipolar, and you almost certainly need to take treatment. And hearing her say that was the first domino that fell for me of stigma. That was the first time I began to look at my illness as an illness, not as a weakness or a character flaw. And that was the beginning of me. I still had a lot of difficult things to go through, but it was the beginning of me becoming, I guess, coming to terms with, I have an illness that I need to manage. And once I started thinking of it in those terms, I eventually was able to get treatment and recover very well and live with it very well.
Well, I think you had an astute psychologist that would recognize that, like myself as a psychotherapist with my training, obviously, right? Because talk therapy is not going to will you out of this. That's and right. Like you said, it's not like there wasn't any drugs happening at that point or anything in your life. So sometimes you kind of try to weed out all the things that potentially could be happening. Was there trauma before age 5? All those things as a psychotherapist you're looking for potentially that could kind of impact some of the symptoms that we see with, say, complex PTSD. But she recognized that there wasn't any of those things. Yeah. And she kind of started to realize, oh goodness, this talk therapy is not going to talk you out of this. Yeah. But somebody without the specialty would not have recognized that and would have kept going. And then obviously you'd go through those circles, right? Like you go up, you go down, which would be even worse on you. So obviously when you're on the high and you can't stop and you're thinking, why can't I stop? And then when you're at the low and you can get out of bed and you can't do anything, that's tough on you too.
Oh, it absolutely took my life and turned it upside down because I was suddenly trying to work through essentially, I went through almost 3 straight years where I wasn't at my baseline for 1 minute. I started, the first departure from my baseline was a depression. And then I went directly up and then back down and then up and then down. And it went like that for almost 3 straight years. That is an incredibly long time to never feel like yourself.
For sure.
And so that, and it affected work for sure. Both the highs and the lows affected work. You asked if people were noticing. When it was mild, it was less obvious because mild depression, you can just seem a little distracted or tired or, maybe you write it off like, oh, maybe you've got a flu or something. If you are mildly hypomanic, that is extremely hard to notice if you're a colleague because the symptoms really are so close to a type A personality with energy. It's really not that different, but where the difference lies is in your personal life because you suddenly need less sleep. Your energy never goes away. It's 24/7. Even when you're asleep, I described my sleep during hypomanic and manic phases as active. It was like there was this sort of constant buzz of energy going through your body. And your colleagues might not notice a mild hypomanic phase, but your partner will. Because they'll notice that you're like, why are you suddenly only getting 6 hours a night when you used to get 7 or 8? And why do you wake up at 6 a.m. when you used to drag your butt out of bed to the shower? Now you're jumping out of bed with all this energy. I mean, that's a big change. Mm-hmm. And so that's why knowing your baseline is so important. If you're going to try to determine what's happening to you in the realm of a mental illness, you need to know what is your healthy normal. Because like one of my friends, his healthy normal is 5 hours sleep a night. That's normal for him. That's good for him. It works for him. If I did that every night, I'd be sick. There's no way I could do that. So these are important things to understand about yourself. And I had figured that out. But when I look back at the way I went through all of this, in no way would the experience have been easy or simple, even if I did not have stigma towards mental illness. But it would have been far easier, far faster. I would have sought treatment much earlier, and it would have been far less painful for sure if there was no stigma from the outset. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned at the beginning in my bio, there is a key experience that I went through that really helped me ultimately get to this realization. And that's why my book is called Jason 1, Stigma 0. It's because I finally beat stigma. Stigma owned me for a long time, and then I finally found a way to beat it. And the way I beat it was to look back on the experience I'd had when I was 12 years old. I'd had open heart surgery for a heart defect. And when you're a 12-year-old boy and you have a heart defect, you are understandably supported and rallied around as much as you can imagine. I was never judged or questioned, or nobody asked about my will or my character or how hard I was trying. Nobody questioned the treatments I was given. Everyone recognized that this was something happening to me and I needed empathy and support. And I never judged myself. I didn't feel guilty that my heart wasn't working. But when I was in my 20s and my brain wasn't working, I felt all those things. And it was only when I realized, what would I have done in my 20s if instead of bipolar beginning, what if my heart problem had come back? It could have. It's a nerve defect in my heart. What if it grew back? Would I have felt ashamed or scared? Would I have not spoken about it at work? Would I have stigmatized myself? Not at all. I wouldn't have done any of those things. I would have talked about it openly because it's a failure in my body that's not my fault. And I would have received empathy and support. But because of the stigma around mental illness, none of those things happened. Part of it was my fault, and part of it was because others had stigma towards my illness as well. And that was the light bulb moment that I realized, wait a minute, we're looking at these illnesses incorrectly. We're treating mental illness as different than illness. It's as though we're treating it as a personality problem. And as long as we can sort that up and separate that out, that's how we can get rid of stigma. And that's how we can begin to respond properly to the instances of mental illness in our lives, whether it's personal or professional.
So did you continue to talk about it with a professional, or did you kind of get support from your family, from your partner, to be able to kind of the self-realization, hey, it's something, there's an imbalance, bottom line, right? Like, I mean, because I often say to my clients, I said, if I fell and broke my ankle right now, you would rush me down to the closest emerge here in Niagara. I said, but if all of a sudden I have a nervous breakdown, nobody would know, or they'd think twice about what they're going to do because we're so afraid of that. But really, what's the difference? One's physical, one's mental and emotional, but we're one system. We're one person.
That's right.
But we treat it completely differently, right?
We really do. And there's no reason for it. And the way that I can be very stubborn, and I was stubborn in the wrong way for a while, in that I had this stigma and I had this resistance to a diagnosis of mental illness. I was afraid of taking a medication. And I don't know why. I just was. I had a stigma towards it. But when that psychologist said that to me, it was like, when I say the first domino, I mean, it was literally like that. There was a wall in front of me. She knocked down the first domino, and then they just kept going. So from that moment on, the stigma it evaporated, and I made a conscious decision to treat my bipolar disorder, or whatever this illness was that I was facing, in the same way I would treat my heart problem, which is, it's an illness. I need to learn about it. I need to manage it. I need to be active in the relationship with my doctors to, understand what I should be doing and not doing. And once I went on that path, as I said, it wasn't smooth sailing. I still had a few very severe depressions. I had a manic episode. I ended up hospitalized as a result of the manic episode. But none of those things happened because of stigma. Those things happened because the illness just became extreme for a bit. And I had to go through that. But in fact, the ability to get over the stigma just prior to that extreme period helped me to survive that extreme period, because I recognized while I was going through it that my body was failing me, that it wasn't me.
Right.
That gave me hope that all I had to do was find the right treatment, and I would be able to get back to me. And ultimately, that's what happened. I was diagnosed as bipolar in February 2005 while in the hospital, and after my manic episode, and I was given a new treatment that I'd never been on before, which was lithium. And I was told it would take months before it was therapeutic, because it's a very tricky drug. You can't have too much of it in your blood, or else it's toxic. So we do a stair-step approach, kind of creeping up to the therapeutic level. And it was June of 2005 was the end of that 3-year run where I had not been at my baseline. I was taking 5 pills of lithium, so 1,500 milligrams of lithium. And I saw my psychiatrist. I still was depressed. And he said, look, you're not quite at the therapeutic level. We're going to increase it by 1 more tonight or now. And he said, take 6 pills tonight and give it 2 weeks to 3 weeks. And if you don't feel any better, come back. We will likely need to add a second medication. And that night, I took 6 little white pills instead of 5. I woke up the next morning, and the first words out of my mouth were, I feel like me. I didn't feel, the word isn't better, the word isn't good, the word is I feel absent of symptoms of bipolar disorder. I don't feel down, I don't feel up, I just feel like me. And it was the first time in 3 years. And it was a very exciting moment because it gave me hope that, okay, this is a chemical imbalance and I've found the treatment that is correcting that imbalance. Mm-hmm. And from that day on, I have taken the medication very happily. I don't have any compliance issues with the medication because I view the medication as a matter of fortune and luck that I even have a treatment that works so well. There's many people with mental illness that don't find a treatment that works so well. So I take it happily, and I have never, since that day in 2005, I've never experienced any of the upside of bipolar. No hypomania, no mania at all. I have had some depressive episodes and needed to treat those separately, but that's it. I've only had to manage that side.
So you've kind of worked on obviously working with your cognitions and understanding when your body's getting run down. Are you constantly having to still look at those things even though you're taking the medications? Because I would think that there's I always say there's a psychosocial part to it to learn, just to be able to recognize if you're working a bit too hard or, if there's conflict or whatever. Like all of us have to be able to recognize certain things and continue to work on ourselves.
Absolutely. Yes. So there's a term that I use, I've been using for years, and it helps me to understand what I need to do to manage my illness. And I use it with others to try to get them to see it in this way. But I believe that the only way you can survive a chronic lifelong illness like a mental illness, bipolar is not something that's going to just go away. Mm-hmm. It's not something that I recover completely from. I have it. So I view it as I need to own my illness. I need to accept it, because if I don't fully accept it, then I will always resent the treatment. I will be sloppy about managing it. I will, maybe get lazy. So I view it as, I don't like that I have bipolar. Of course, I'd rather not have it, but I do have it. And so I need to manage this illness, and that management doesn't stop. You're absolutely right. I watch, and it's not as exhausting as it may sound when you first hear it, but I have systems. I have basically charts that I use to track my mood, to say, have I gone above my baseline at any point in the last month? And eventually you start doing it by quarter if things are going well. But I also ask myself very honestly, am I going below my baseline? And if I am, is it a few days? Is it more than a week? Is it 2 weeks? And so I know I can show you charts that I have been keeping since, I actually did them retroactively all the way to 2000. And I have them to today. They're annual charts, and they simply show, is my mood above or below the baseline? That is so vital for me to, understand trends, understand, for example, if a depressive episode happens, I always ask myself, okay, what happened the previous 3 months? As you say, was I run down? Was I overworked? Was I doing too much? And I have become quite good at finding my what I consider it as an energy output balance. I can only do so much in every day, so much in every week, so much in every month. If I go beyond that, I will pay a price. And usually that price is a very short depressive episode of 1 to 5 days. Mm-hmm. I minimize how often those happen by managing my energy output. So that is active, ongoing thing that I do. And, and a big way I do that is sleep. I'm someone, as I say earlier, 5 hours a night would be awful for me. I like 7 to 8. Mm-hmm. If I get 6 hours of sleep on any given night, it's no big deal. but I make sure the next night I get 7 or 8.
You catch up.
Don't
Yeah.
allow 6, 6, 6, 6, because that will absolutely affect me, and I know that. If I have a huge work day, I got to put in a 15-hour work day where I'm really, really, or I'm in a crunch. I never let my crunch sort of schedule last longer than 3 to 5 days. Then I pull completely back, shut it off, and rest. And those are the ways that I've been able to manage the illness. And what it has resulted is, in the last 5 years, I average 2 to 3 very short depressive episodes a year. And that seems to be all that I'm having to deal with. And they're predictable. When they come, I know as soon as they hit me, I wake up and I feel, it's like I get the flu. I feel awful. I feel exhausted. I feel my mental acuity is suddenly gone. And I don't experience depression like sadness. For me, it's more like being shut off. It's like you're underfed. Your energy levels are super low. You don't have access to any kind of fire or energy. And I just simply shut it down and rest. I clear my calendar and I rest for a couple of days. And I always, so far, knock on wood, that they only last 3 to 5 days, and I bounce back and I feel great after that. So
the people around you, they must be, I mean, you must, do you have a family, Jason?
No, I'm married, but
okay. So, but your wife must know that, or I know you have a business partner too.
Yes.
So they're kind of, I'm sure you talk about the things that you're experiencing. If you realize, goodness, I'm on a crunch or whatever. So they are kind of aware of what kind of things are happening with you.
Absolutely. And
Okay.
One of the things about speaking openly about an illness, and for a second, let's not think about it as a mental illness. Just think about it as an illness. If you were in the midst of chemotherapy treatments because of cancer, if you planned on doing this meeting and having this interview with me, but then you had a adverse reaction to your chemo treatment on Friday, you didn't recover fast enough, you would tell me. You would say, look, I'm going through treatments. Yeah. What's happening? I can't have this meeting for that reason. And anyone in my position would feel nothing but empathy for you, recognizing that you've got this challenge that you're struggling against. And we would say, okay, no worries, we'll reschedule. That's the attitude I bring to my mental illness. If it interferes with my life, I speak openly about it to anyone that I'm interacting with. So my wife knows, my family knows, my friends know, and my business partner knows. And that is very important. You need caregivers in your life who can support you and who understand that what you're facing is an illness. And it's something that is beyond, it's beyond your control, and it deserves that empathy.
Obviously, if I was having an issue, say with a chemotherapy treatment, you would be very understanding, and, you would say, okay, Roxanne, no big deal. So it's really about sharing at the same level.
Sharing at the same level. And here's the thing about stigma that's fascinating, is that if I have, like I did, a stigma towards my own illness, if I'm uncomfortable speaking about bipolar, then I'm going to talk in circles around it. And that is going to make you very uncomfortable about what you can say to me. Because you understand, you'll actually, you will sense my discomfort, and you will want to respect my privacy, and it will tie your hands. But if I speak openly about bipolar disorder, it frees you up to do the same thing. So it's an unfortunate reality, and I've said this to a lot of people that I've spoken to who have their own, they have a mental illness and they're afraid of the stigma. I say to them, it's counterintuitive, but the best way for you to fight stigma is for you to defeat it first, and then just start speaking about this as frankly and as flatly as you would any other illness.
So, so your point is that the more comfortable you get with it as the person, people around you will get more comfortable, which I think is so true. Right. That said, let's talk a little bit about the workplace, and kind of, I know that's you do a lot with Stigma Zero with workplaces, and you're lucky and fortunate to be in a space to be able to be around people that you work with that understand it. But to the average person in work, what do you find that you're seeing out there when you go out to do trainings for Stigma Zero?
I am seeing that there is a lot of truth in the way you said it at the beginning of this this interview. We are headed in the right direction, but we have a long, long way to go. So
Right.
people are less stubbornly stigmatic towards mental illness. So in the past, people would actually defend their intellectual position as viewing depression as a weakness. You're not going to hear that as much anymore. I think people recognize that that's not that's not a strong place to stand, and they see that we need to look at it in this way. But getting to the place where people feel comfortable telling their manager about the fact that they're struggling with a diagnosis of, or maybe pre-diagnosis, but they suspect they might have anxiety disorder, for example, that is still very uncomfortable in a lot of workplaces, and it depends on the relationship with the managers, the HR, etc. And that's why we built the program that we built. This online program it's called Create Your Stigma Zero Workplace, and we're simply trying to train employees, managers, and HR and senior leaders. We have 3 different tracks, trying to train them in how to have these discussions. And we're also challenging the companies to recognize that if you want your employees to feel comfortable speaking to their managers about a mental illness, you need to establish a culture that won't allow stigma to exist. That's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen. And in fact, it can happen faster than you think if everybody gets on board and it's communicated properly. Because people want the stigma to end. They're just not sure how to make that happen. And they need to trust that it's happening on both sides. So some of the things are, we do say to employees, look, you have to protect yourself. You can't talk about it if you feel that you will be discriminated against. But we also challenge them that if you see the company is heading in that direction and doesn't want to allow stigma, then it is partly your role to participate in this culture change. Mm-hmm. And if you feel good with your manager and your HR person, to talk about it and to recognize that you have a right for reasonable accommodation. Mm-hmm. And that reasonable accommodation might be very simple and minor, like schedule changes that allows for you to live and work in a healthy way. The other thing that we focus on a lot in the workplace is recognizing that managers actually have a very difficult role, because HR are trained to deal with these sensitive topics and conversations. Managers are just people who were good employees and who elevated to the level of manager in their area. That doesn't mean they necessarily know how to sit down and have a conversation with someone about depression. That is not easy to do in the workplace. And I believe that managers have been undertrained for a very long time in this area. How do you have that conversation in a way that respects the individual, that respects you as a person, and respects the company? And how do you know when you should be bringing HR in versus when you don't need to bring HR in? These are all delicate questions, and we spend a lot of time in our program covering that, how to respond as a manager in very tangible ways. Here's a scenario. You have a team member who has been an amazing, like a pillar of your team for 7 years. Great work, consistent, everything's good. And suddenly their work drops off, their energy levels are low, they seem distant. Now at that moment, you have no idea whether the reason this has happened is because their parent is dying, they're getting a divorce, they've recently started struggling with alcohol, or they have a mental illness. It could be anything like that. Mm-hmm. So the question becomes, how do you have a conversation with that team member without invading their privacy, but showing them support and giving them their due, which is, look, you have been a great employee for a long, long time, but you haven't been yourself these last 3 weeks. I just want you to know if there's anything that I or the company can do to help you, let us know. Like that kind of conversation can happen. And often when it starts with that level of emotional intelligence and empathy, the employee will disclose because they will feel comfortable. That's
right. And they have to accommodate them. Like, that's the thing, and if it's the uncomfortability of the manager for whatever reason, like you said, even your self-stigma, that person has to recognize you're in this authority position because you get tactical things done, but you're dealing with people. and to recognize
That's
what
right.
kind of things you do to make people comfortable to say, yeah, actually, I'm going through a separation, or, I've been not sleeping well, or, I've been maybe drinking a little bit more. And, of course, they could go off and see EAP services, whatever, is to be able to know how to have that conversation in a kind, caring way to say, I support you. I see you, I hear you, I recognize that you need something, go get the assistance, we'll loop back. But a lot of people are so afraid because it's like, well, I'm stepping into their personal life. Well, to some degree, just being kind and gentle is the best way to do that.
Absolutely. And I also remind companies that, look, I lived it. I lived it as an employee, right? I was the employee who was sick. And yes, stigma caused a lot of challenges in here, but that does not absolve me. I signed a contract with my employer to do a job, and now my health is getting in the way of doing that job. The employer is not at fault at all. And I know I'm not at fault, but I am responsible for finding a way to either work within the bounds of my new reality, which is this illness is limiting me in my job. So maybe I need to take a leave of absence, or maybe I need a reasonable accommodation, but I can't just shut down and say nothing to my employer. That completely ties their hands.
Right.
I'm doing a job and accepting payment for that job. Part of that responsibility is that communication. Now, there is the other side of the coin, which is if you have a truly negative, stigmatized manager who might discriminate against you, then of course you might be afraid to discuss it. And that's the global problem we're trying to change. But what I'm seeing in a lot of workplaces is that is not as common anymore. It is there, but there are fewer and fewer truly mean-spirited, discriminatory people when it comes to mental illness. It's mostly just that their empathy and their emotional intelligence is a little low, and they need to understand they're not seeing the mental illness as an illness, and they're caught in the trap I was in originally, which is that it's just he's just distracted and lazy. They're writing it off as a personality thing. And I'm finding that once people are fully grasping the physicality of mental illness, they begin to treat it more like the cancer or the broken leg or the other analogies that we've been using. They recognize it as I always say, something that happened to that person, not something that they did wrong. That's a very simple turn of phrase, but it's powerful, because
right.
When I see that you did something to yourself, I feel a little less empathy for you. But if I see that it happened to you, my instinct is going to always be to have a bit more empathy. And that's so important.
So it's really, if we can raise people's empathy levels to just say, you're working with people, regardless of what the issue is. If someone's struggling, just, it's not always performance related issues. It may show out that way, but why is that? If that person has been a stellar employee for 5 years and all of a sudden, you're recognizing something's progressively changed, or maybe it's changed a little bit over time. It's about having just a normal conversation, a two-way conversation to say, hey, I've noticed X, Y, Z, which is factual, to get the employee to be able to elicit some kind of information. Yeah, I know I've been late lately, but this is what's been going on, whatever. Okay, you kind of get them the right support. But if people are afraid to think, if I have depression and you're my employer and you're going to judge me, then I'm going to shut down, and that's not going to help anybody involved.
Not at all. It just drags out the problem. And the studies have shown over and over and over again that it's actually not the absences that are costing the most when it comes to the lost productivity about mental illness. It's presenteeism. It's people trying to work through their illness and doing so at, let's say, 60% capacity. If you have a workforce of 10,000 people and 2,000 or 3,000 of them are working through an illness because they're afraid of disclosing it, and they're working at 60% capacity, that is so much worse than a few of them taking a leave of absence and then coming back when they recover. And so one of the things I have to train my clients about is that a successful implementation of a program like this will, in the first 18 months to 2 years, show an increase in medical absences due to mental illness. You can't avoid that. There are people currently who need them who will now get them. And if you think of that as a bad outcome, you're missing the point. In fact, that has to happen But what will happen is many of those individuals will now find a way to recover, find treatments that work for them, and then they'll come back. And they will be productive employees. And the faster we can get that process going, the better. And another analogy that I use that does work very well to get companies to understand why they need to address this actively or proactively is that imagine if you had a company of 1,000 people, of whom 600 were women between the ages of 21 and 31, and you just were thinking, I really hope none of them get pregnant. You would be a pretty foolish business, right? If you didn't have policies and plans in place for mat leave, you're just not doing your job. You've
Right.
your head in the sand. But that's what's happening with mental illness. Companies are hoping to not have to deal with it rather than proactively dealing with it. And unlike a mat leave where you physically show and then you've got to disappear while you go and give birth, you can actually work with a mental illness for years at 50, 60% capacity and could have go under the radar. That is not good for the company, and it's not good for that individual. So a lot of this—
And it's not good for morale too, because I'm going to, of course, if I come forward and I'm not treated well, how many people are not going to come forward that are at 60%? So if you do it well with the person coming forward, then others are going to say, I recognize there's assistance for me. I can get the right kind of support. And then like you said, in that benchmark of the 18 months or 2 years, then people kind of get the right things where that short-term disability doesn't become a turnstile, but it actually, someone goes off, they get the appropriate treatment, they get the appropriate medication, and they come back to work and they learn to accommodate accordingly until they can kind of do that work hardening to get back 100% to their job.
Extremely well said. That's exactly one of the main points that we make is that if you encourage people to come forward and then mishandle it, you are missing such an opportunity, and you will shut a lot of people down for a long time because they're watching. And there's another thing that we do, and this is an important thing. We have had companies ask us, we like your program. What if we just wanted to do managers? Or what if we just wanted to do HR? And we always say to them, look, you can do that, but it won't work. You cannot train a part of your organization on this topic. This has to be done wall to wall, every employee all the way up to the CEO. And the reason is everyone else needs to trust the other has taken the same thing and is on the same page. Because if I'm a manager, how am I supposed to help my employee if they haven't taken this training? Right. And if I'm an employee, how do I trust my manager if they haven't taken this training? It doesn't work. Everyone needs to be, like, we're trying to turn the Titanic here. In the sense of culture change is slow and difficult, but it's possible if everyone gets behind it, everyone communicates it, and there's precedent for this. It's happened over and over again. I mean, it's still sadly happening in a lot of places with sexism, but there is a way to go from, in the 50s and 60s, overt sexism in the workplace was not only commonplace, it was totally accepted, and now overt sexism in the workplace is 100% not accepted. And that culture change is something that can happen. And that's something that we can do in this topic of mental illness and stigma. We can create a world where having a stigma towards mental illness is just not appropriate. It's not acceptable. It's not okay. And the more people get on board with that, the faster that it actually does change.
And I think you're so right? You go from the kind of the macro to the micro. You have to hit everybody to understand exactly what depression is, or what is, an anxiety disorder or a seasonal defect, like whatever the issues are, which will come, like we know, and we know that it's on the increase, be it more situational, which could be, versus endogenous or biological, like people should know that they, even if they are going through something, if you've gone through a death, for instance, yeah, you're going to be upset, you're going to be down, but, when is it that it's, the time period before you could kind of, get back and have dealt with it versus, oh, this is still continuing.
That's right.
It's something a bit more. So I think you're so right, because, and a lot of people go, it's a mental illness. I don't know what to say. And they don't manage their employees because they're just afraid to have normal conversations. Instead of saying, hey, Jason, how are you doing? They're thinking about how they're going to say hi to Jason because they're afraid they're going to trigger something, which is completely ridiculous.
Yes, exactly. No one with a mental illness wants to be treated just like no one with a physical illness, like a cancer or anything like that, wants to be treated that differently. We just don't want to be stigmatized and don't want to be discriminated against. It's not that complicated. And when you realize it that way, that's a big part of what we teach in this program, that it's demystifying. A lot of it is that it's just bringing clarity to these terms and these, the types of language that is good and that isn't. And there's one exercise that I do in my keynotes, and I do it in the program as well. And I find it so effective. It's to let people know, look, don't feel guilty that you have stigmatized thoughts towards mental illness. It is our society has set us up for it it's like a trap that we fall into to be stigmatized or to have stigma towards mental illness, because we have listened and heard unbelievable numbers of words that are stigmatized towards mental illness that we've not heard towards other things. So I do this. I say, I'd like you, it's a safe space. It's going to be a bit weird, but I'd like you to come up with the worst, most stigmatized, most discriminatory words you can think of about mental illness. And I'll start. So I say psycho, crazy, nuts. And then I get them to go. And they're always uncomfortable at first, but then they go. Then the words start coming. And then they keep coming, because there are a lot of them that we know. And so I actually create this chart that I show afterwards. It's got 100 words in it, all discriminatory words about mental illness. And then afterwards, I show them the chart, and I'm like, look, these are words that have been fed to us throughout our lives from movies, television, and people around us. We have a vocabulary to draw upon to be stigmatized about mental illness. Now I say the same question. Think of discriminatory, stigmatized, negative, judgmental words, this time about breast cancer. Room goes silent. Can't think of one, because you don't think of it as something that happened, that the woman did wrong. It's something that happened to her. And so my point in doing that is to really get rid of stigma is a little bit like losing weight. It's actually a discipline. You have to watch your diet, and you have to make choices, and you have to work out. You have to choose to lose weight. You won't just lose weight easily. It's a choice, and it's a process. Stigma is one of those things. You can say, I intellectually agree that mental illness is not that person's fault, but you still have to choose not to think those negative thoughts, because they're just there. Not because you're a bad person, because the words would be.
Absolutely. And it's ongoing. It's ongoing. And you have to, commend people that are making the changes even when nobody's looking.
Yes.
I think that becomes very important. And obviously with me, seeing it from, I've worked trauma in frontline with the police all the way up to running different facilities with mental health and addictions and in corporations. So I've seen it at every end. Yeah. It's really about recognize we're people, and we all are going to have something. We all have something that we deal with on an ongoing basis. And with it on the rise, we have to recognize that we need to support people so that they can live the best lives possible. And this training program sounds amazing, Jason. So why don't you tell people, anyone that, if it's companies that are interested in the training, and about your book, where they can reach you and I know the release is about to come soon.
Yes, thank you. So the program and the book are both available at, it's www.stigmazero.com, and it's zero spelled out. So STIGMAZERO.com. And the website is, it very clearly explains what the Stigma Zero Online Training Academy is and how we offer employers. This is definitely a B2B offering. That said, if there are any individuals out there who wish to take the program, we're not closed to that. It's just that that's not our main model. We do encourage you to reach out to us if you're interested for that. We don't want to hold, we're not trying to limit it. On the website, you can try to get started right there, and it sends us a note, and we create a meeting. This is not something that is purchased online immediately. We always want to have a consultation, provide a demo of the course, so that each company can really get a sense of what it is that we're trying to do. And then we offer a full onboarding guideline on how to get this thing going within a company. And as for my book, at the same website, there is a tab that says simply book. The book is called Jason 1 Stigma 0, My Battle with Mental Illness at Home and in the Workplace. And that will be released in print, ebook, and audiobook formats in March. I actually don't have a date yet, but if you go to the book page of our website, you'll see there is a spot for a pre-order request. If you pop your email in there, you'll get an email when the book is available. So,
awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Can't wait to read it. Sounds quite interesting from our conversation today. And, when I listen to Jason, it reinforces so many things that I talk about. I talk about being authentic, but if we're going to be connected to ourselves, really internally, our map is our map, and whatever we're given, and we have to learn to deal with whatever's happening for us. And we all have different things going on in our lives all the time. And just to stay connected to yourself as much as possible, whatever those needs are. If it's anything from I'm, mentally ill to I've got something going on that's situational that may be making me feel uncomfortable, to go forward. If you're at work, be able to approach the people that are sensitive and kind. But if you don't go forward, then nobody can assist you to get whatever you're needing, whether it's an accommodation or just you being able to sit, take some time off to be able to address these concerns. So thanks again, Jason, for coming on, and maybe we'll have you on again at some point once the book's released. And for anybody trying to get more information on me about authenticity and leadership, you can reach me at roxannederhodge.com. Take care, and we'll chat with you next week.
Thanks for tuning in to Authentic Living with Roxanne, creating the space for positive, healthy change. Roxanne is a keynote speaker, psychotherapist, and coach. To work with Roxanne, visit roxannederhodge.com/blueprint. We'll see you next time on Authentic Living with Roxanne.